Tonight, we're covering one of the most difficult and defining chapters in modern history, the Great Depression. From the roaring highs of the 1920s to the devastating lows that followed, this is the story of how an entire world economy collapsed, how millions lost everything, and how a nation struggled to find its way back. We'll follow the fall of Wall Street, the rise of Roosevelt, the storm of dust on the plains, and the road to recovery shaped not by prosperity, but by war. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you're watching. Now, let's settle in and explore the story of a generation shaped by hardship and the lessons they left behind. In the years following the First World War, the United States entered a period of transformation so rapid, so thrilling, and so seemingly unstoppable that it earned a name still spoken with awe and disbelief: the Roaring Twenties. Cities climbed higher, jazz pulsed through nightclubs, and money, or the illusion of it, flowed like champagne from coast to coast. For many, it felt like a new world had arrived, one where technology and optimism would bury the hardships of the past forever. The war had left much of Europe wounded and weary, but America, untouched by the destruction that scarred the old world, had emerged stronger than ever. Industries boomed. Automobiles, once a luxury, rolled off assembly lines by the millions. Radios filled homes with news, music, and advertisements. Skyscrapers pierced the skyline in cities like New York and Chicago. A consumer economy blossomed, fueled by credit, advertising, and a belief that prosperity was not only possible, it was inevitable. But beneath the glittering surface, the structure was fragile. Wealth, though growing, was unevenly distributed. While factory owners and financiers reaped immense profits, millions of workers and farmers struggled. Rural communities, in particular, saw little of the prosperity. Mechanization and falling crop prices pushed farmers into debt, even as banks and investors speculated wildly in booming markets. The stock market, once the realm of cautious investors, had become a nationwide obsession. Ordinary citizens, spurred on by a belief in endless gains, bought stocks on margin, borrowing money to buy shares whose value they expected to rise. Speculation became a fever. Stock prices soared not because of solid fundamentals, but because everyone believed they would keep rising. Newspapers celebrated overnight millionaires. Wall Street became a symbol of American genius and daring. Political leaders, including President Calvin Coolidge, offered little regulation or concern. When asked if the market was overheating, most experts, and the financial press, waved off the question. The fundamentals are sound, they insisted. Yet warnings began to trickle through. A few economists, like Roger Babson, spoke of a coming correction. Even Herbert Hoover, elected president in 1928, sensed danger. But their concerns were drowned out by the roar of prosperity. In late 1929, the market reached a dizzying peak. Then, slowly, it began to falter. By October, panic began to set in. On Thursday, October 24th, prices plunged in what would be remembered as Black Thursday. Traders swarmed the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Phones rang unanswered. Bankers rushed to prop up prices. A brief rebound gave hope. But on Tuesday, October 29th, the bottom dropped out. Black Tuesday, as it became known, was the largest collapse the market had ever seen. Over 16 million shares were traded in a single day. Fortunes vanished. Banks that had loaned recklessly faced ruin. Margin buyers, unable to cover their debts, were wiped out. The crash was swift, brutal, and shocking. But at first, many believed it was only a market correction, a financial storm that would pass. After all, the economy was strong, wasn't it? Production, consumption, industry, they would recover. This was just a bad week, maybe a bad month. What no one yet understood was that the crash had not merely shaken investor confidence. It had broken something deeper. A system built on credit, speculation, and imbalance was beginning to unravel. The real storm was only beginning. And before it ended, it would bring not just Wall Street to its knees, but factories, farms, families, entire nations. The illusion had ended. Now came the reckoning. In the weeks and months following the collapse of the stock market in October 1929, the panic that had first been contained to Wall Street began to seep outward like a slow and rising flood. What many had initially dismissed as a temporary correction or a speculative bubble bursting soon revealed itself to be something far more insidious and enduring, a structural unraveling of confidence, credit, and commerce that would leave no part of the economy untouched. At first, there was an eerie calm in many parts of the country. The newspapers continued to reassure the public that recovery was imminent, that American industry was too strong and too innovative to be halted by a mere panic in the stock exchange. Politicians spoke confidently about adjustments, offering reassurance that the worst had passed. But behind these reassurances, cracks had begun to widen in every corner of the economy. Banks, which had grown rapidly during the boom years and had often lent money recklessly to fuel speculation, now found themselves exposed and vulnerable. As stock prices tumbled and borrowers defaulted, these institutions, many of them small and localized, began to collapse under the weight of bad loans. A dangerous cycle began. As banks failed, depositors panicked and rushed to withdraw their savings, which only hastened the bank's demise, because under the rules of the time, there was no government guarantee that their money would be safe. What began as a financial collapse on Wall Street turned into a wave of banking failures that swept through small towns and cities alike, stripping communities of their economic lifelines. As banks failed and credit dried up, businesses could no longer secure the loans they needed to operate. Factories began laying off workers or closing altogether. Orders stopped coming in. Warehouses filled with unsold goods. Inventories sat idle while assembly lines went silent. Across the manufacturing centers of the Northeast and the Midwest, tens of thousands of workers found themselves suddenly without jobs, with no safety net, no severance, and no certainty as to where their next meal would come from. In the agricultural heartland, conditions were already grim, and the crash only deepened the crisis. Farmers, who had struggled for years with falling crop prices, found themselves unable to sell their goods at any price that could support their families or pay off their debts. Those who had borrowed money to buy land or equipment during the boom now faced foreclosure. Tractors were repossessed. Barns were abandoned. Entire families watched helplessly as generations of work were lost in foreclosure auctions, often attended by neighbors who themselves had no more than a few dollars to spare. The emotional toll was as devastating as the financial one. Breadlines began to appear in city streets, often stretching for blocks as men in worn suits and women in threadbare coats waited silently for a chance to feed their children. Soup kitchens sprang up, hastily organized by churches, charities, or simply compassionate neighbors. Families that had once lived comfortably found themselves selling their belongings piece by piece, pawning jewelry and furniture for a few days' worth of groceries or coal. What made the crisis so cruel was not only the speed with which it had spread, but the sense of helplessness it instilled. The old rules, work hard, save money, be prudent, had offered no protection. The virtues of thrift and discipline, once praised as the foundation of American life, had proven useless in the face of a system that had collapsed not from laziness or corruption, but from the fragile illusion of endless growth. As winter settled in across the country in late 1929 and early 1930, it became increasingly clear that the crash had not merely disrupted the economy, it had upended the very idea of stability itself. What had seemed like a brief setback was now a deepening collapse, one that no individual effort could outrun, and which no government action had yet begun to meaningfully address. By the spring of 1930, the United States stood at a crossroads between the hopeful expectations of recovery and the grim reality of deepening collapse. President Herbert Hoover, a man known for his efficiency, humanitarian efforts during World War I, and belief in the power of individual initiative, had taken office only months before the market crash. Despite his impressive resume and keen intellect, he found himself utterly unprepared for the magnitude and complexity of the unfolding disaster. Hoover's response to the crisis was guided by his deep-seated philosophy of rugged individualism, the belief that the federal government should not become overly involved in economic life, and that the nation's strength came from its self-reliant citizens, communities, and local institutions. He feared that direct federal aid to the unemployed would create dependency, weaken the moral fabric of the nation, and set a dangerous precedent. Instead, he encouraged voluntary cooperation between businesses and workers, urged charities to increase their efforts, and hoped that by maintaining wages and production, private industry could weather the storm on its own. But conditions on the ground told a different story. Unemployment, which had stood at around 3% before the crash, had already soared past 8% by the end of 1930 and continued to rise. By the following year, millions of Americans were out of work. Entire industries collapsed under the weight of vanished demand. In cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, where the economy had once thrived on steel, automobiles, and manufacturing, the hum of machines was replaced by silence, and the daily routine of work was replaced by idleness, soup lines, and desperation. In rural areas, things were no better. Farmers who could not afford to harvest their crops began to watch them rot in the fields. Milk was dumped in ditches because it could not be sold at a price that covered the cost of delivery. Livestock were slaughtered and buried because feed was too expensive, and the market had dried up. Meanwhile, children in cities went hungry and malnourished, families burned furniture to stay warm, and shantytowns, makeshift shelters constructed from scrap wood, cardboard, and tin, sprang up on the outskirts of every major city. These sprawling encampments, sarcastically dubbed Hoovervilles, became one of the most visible symbols of the failure of Hoover's policies. Their very name reflected the public's growing frustration with a president who seemed either unable or unwilling to act decisively. Newspaper blankets were called Hoover blankets. Empty pockets turned inside out were known as Hoover flags. The scorn was personal, and it spread quickly. Despite mounting evidence of systemic collapse, Hoover continued to insist that the economy was fundamentally sound and that recovery was just around the corner. He signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, intended to protect American industries by raising tariffs on imported goods. But rather than stimulate domestic production, the move triggered a wave of retaliatory tariffs from other nations, causing international trade to shrink and deepening the global economic crisis. Faith in traditional institutions began to erode. Banks continued to fail by the hundreds. Those still in business grew increasingly cautious, refusing to lend to struggling businesses or farmers, which only worsened the downturn. Savings vanished overnight, and with them, the trust that had once underpinned the entire financial system. By 1931, the Depression was no longer just an economic crisis, it had become a national trauma, a collective experience of hardship that transcended class, race, and geography. Millions of Americans who had once believed in the promises of prosperity, in the fairness of capitalism, and in the power of hard work to secure a better life, now found themselves questioning everything. What had gone wrong? And who, if anyone, would fix it? The answers would come slowly, but not before the pain deepened and the very idea of the American dream was called into question. While the cities faced the biting wind of unemployment and the silence of shuttered factories, the American countryside endured a quieter catastrophe, one that did not arrive with headlines, but instead crept in over the horizon as a choking haze of dust and despair. In the heartland, from the panhandle of Texas to the plains of Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, a man-made disaster was forming that would come to be known as the Dust Bowl, and it would scar the landscape just as deeply as the Depression was scarring the economy. The root of the problem had been sown decades earlier. Encouraged by government incentives and inflated promises of fertile farmland, settlers had moved into the Great Plains in large numbers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They tore up the native prairie grasses to plant wheat and other crops, using mechanized farming methods that ignored the region's delicate ecological balance. For a time, it worked. The land seemed bountiful, and farmers reaped profits. But beneath the surface, the soil, once held in place by deep-rooted grasses, became vulnerable. When drought returned in the early 1930s, it came not as a single dry season but as a prolonged and brutal chain of dry years. Crops withered. Rain refused to fall. And with no plant cover to hold the soil down, the winds came and took what was left. What had once been productive farmland was now a vast, cracked desert. Dust storms, called black blizzards, swept across the plains, darkening skies, burying fences, and creeping into homes through every crack and crevice. Families awoke to find their rooms coated in dirt, their livestock dead from inhalation, and their children coughing up soil from lungs that could no longer breathe clean air. As the storms grew more frequent and more violent, desperation took root. Farmers, already crushed by debt and falling prices, found that even if they could grow something, they could not sell it. Entire communities were abandoned as families packed what little they had and headed west in search of a future that no longer seemed to exist where they were. They became migrant laborers, many of them known as Okies, regardless of whether they came from Oklahoma or elsewhere. They piled into battered trucks and jalopies, heading toward California with dreams of orange groves, seasonal work, and sunshine, only to find more hardship, overcrowded camps, and bitter resentment from locals who saw them as a burden or threat. The Dust Bowl was not simply a natural disaster, it was the result of policy, ignorance, and greed. It exposed how fragile progress could be when it ignored the wisdom of the land and the limits of nature. And it magnified the pain of the Depression by making survival itself a daily struggle, not just in terms of economics, but in the most elemental needs: air to breathe, water to drink, land to stand on. The federal government responded slowly, as it had to the broader depression. But eventually, soil conservation programs were introduced, replanting efforts were begun, and lessons, hard-won and late in coming, were learned about how to farm in dry regions. Still, for those who had already lost everything, these efforts arrived too late. By the mid-1930s, over 2 million people had fled the Dust Bowl region. It became one of the largest internal migrations in American history. They carried with them not only their meager belongings, but also stories of loss, resilience, and hope, stories that would later be immortalized in novels, photographs, and folk songs. In a time when the cities were paralyzed by economic collapse, the countryside was being buried, not by policy or banks, but by wind and dust and silence. While the Great Depression had begun in the United States, it did not remain confined to its borders. As the crisis deepened, it rippled outward through the arteries of global finance and trade, sending shockwaves across Europe, Latin America, Asia, and beyond. What had once been a tremor in the American economy soon became a worldwide convulsion, a dramatic unraveling of prosperity that exposed the interdependence of nations and the fragility of the modern economic system. In the 1920s, the United States had become the world's primary creditor, lending billions of dollars to war-torn European nations in the aftermath of World War I. Much of Germany's fragile post-war recovery, for instance, had been propped up by American loans funneled through the Dawes Plan, which allowed Germany to pay reparations to Britain and France, who in turn used those payments to repay their own debts to American banks. It was a circular system, delicately balanced on the assumption that prosperity would continue uninterrupted. When the U.S. stock market crashed and American credit dried up, the whole structure began to collapse. Germany was among the hardest hit. The fragile Weimar Republic, already plagued by political instability and hyperinflation during the early 1920s, now faced mass unemployment, banking failures, and a sense of desperation that began to fuel dangerous political movements. By 1932, unemployment in Germany had reached nearly 30%, and extremist parties, particularly Adolf Hitler's National Socialists, began to gain significant traction by promising order, purpose, and revenge against the forces they claimed had brought humiliation to Germany. In Britain, the Depression led to widespread joblessness, especially in industrial regions such as Wales and the north of England. Protests and hunger marches erupted across the country. The government, reluctant to abandon the gold standard and committed to balanced budgets, implemented austerity measures that only deepened the suffering. Though violence was less pronounced than elsewhere, the social strain was undeniable. France, more rural and less dependent on foreign capital, at first seemed somewhat insulated. But as trade collapsed and the global economy contracted, France too found itself in crisis. Political instability followed, with frequent changes in government and growing polarization between the right and left. In Latin America, nations that had depended heavily on exports of raw materials, coffee, sugar, tin, rubber, found themselves crippled by collapsing global demand. Countries like Brazil and Argentina experienced economic freefall. Dictatorships and authoritarian regimes rose, promising national recovery and order in exchange for democratic freedoms. Even in faraway regions like Asia, the Depression took a toll. In British India, peasant farmers suffered from falling prices for jute, cotton, and rice. In Japan, the crisis accelerated the rise of militarism. With exports collapsing, the Japanese government turned inward, embracing aggressive nationalism and expansionism, a path that would, within a decade, lead the nation into brutal wars in China and eventually against the United States and its allies. The Depression was not merely an economic event, it was a test of governments, ideologies, and institutions. Across the world, democracies struggled to respond quickly or effectively, and in their place, many citizens turned toward authoritarian leaders who promised swift solutions and national rebirth. In this global climate of fear and uncertainty, movements rooted in fascism, communism, and radical nationalism gained footholds. The social fabric of entire nations began to fray. Unemployment led to homelessness. Homelessness gave way to crime, addiction, and despair. In some countries, governments collapsed entirely. In others, they transformed into something darker and more repressive. And all the while, as economies shrank and societies unraveled, ordinary people, workers, farmers, clerks, mothers, veterans, tried to survive in a world that had lost its balance. The Depression had begun with a market crash in New York. Now, it had become a global reckoning. By the early 1930s, the United States had reached a point of almost unimaginable despair. Every statistic that once marked national strength, production, employment, consumer spending, agricultural output, now served as a grim reminder of a nation that had collapsed under its own weight. Unemployment soared to levels that had once seemed unthinkable, peaking at nearly 25% by 1933. 1 out of every 4 American workers was without a job. In some industrial cities, that number was even higher. And yet, these numbers only told part of the story. For those still employed, wages were often slashed to subsistence levels. Hours were reduced, and job security became a fantasy. Skilled laborers took work as janitors, former clerks stood on street corners selling apples, and factory workers lined up daily in hopes of a few hours of paid labor. The middle class, once the pride of American growth, teetered on the edge of poverty. Homes were lost to foreclosure, savings evaporated in failed banks, and families were forced to split apart in search of opportunity. It was not uncommon to see men wandering from town to town, hitching rides on freight trains, sleeping in open fields, or crowding into hobo camps, where food was shared and stories exchanged under the uncertain promise of finding work in the next town over. The railways carried not just goods, but now desperation itself. Whole generations of young men rode the rails, their dreams wrapped in blankets and tied to sticks, their futures as unknown as the towns they drifted toward. Women, too, bore the weight of the crisis. Mothers stood in breadlines with children in their arms. Housewives rented out rooms, took in laundry, or scavenged for discarded scraps to turn into meals. Marriage rates fell, birth rates declined, and the idea of raising a family seemed out of reach for many. Children went to school hungry, dropped out to work or wander, and in some cases were sent away entirely because their families could no longer afford to feed them. And yet, despite the national suffering, direct government intervention remained limited. President Herbert Hoover, still clinging to his belief in local charity and private initiative, refused to support widespread federal relief efforts. He argued that the responsibility for recovery lay with local governments and private charities, many of which were themselves overwhelmed or bankrupt. When he did act, such as through the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to support banks and businesses, it was seen as too little and too late, aid directed toward institutions rather than individuals. By 1932, faith in Hoover had collapsed almost entirely. Angry veterans of World War I marched on Washington that summer, demanding early payment of a promised bonus that was not due for over a decade. They built camps in the Capitol and called themselves the Bonus Army. Hoover, fearing unrest, eventually ordered the army to disperse them. Troops, led by General Douglas MacArthur, used tear gas and bayonets to drive the veterans and their families from their makeshift homes. Images of war heroes being attacked by their own government shocked the nation and deepened the sense of betrayal. America in crisis was not just a country in economic ruin, it was a nation on the edge of despair. The democratic institutions that had seemed so stable were now doubted. The promise of the American dream had crumbled. Every part of life, from the way people worked to how they voted, prayed, and dreamed, had been reshaped by scarcity. As the presidential election of 1932 approached, the people of the United States no longer simply wanted leadership, they needed hope. They did not seek miracles, but they needed motion. And in the quiet before the storm of change, a new voice was rising, calm, clear, and confident, offering not just a plan, but a vision. In the fall of 1932, as Americans prepared to vote in the most consequential election in a generation, there was a palpable sense that the country stood at a crossroads. The misery and paralysis of the Hoover years had created not only desperation, but a hunger for change that transcended party lines. Into this uncertain moment stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic governor of New York, a man whose name carried both political weight and personal resilience. FDR, as he would soon be known to the world, had faced trials of his own. Stricken by polio in 1921, he had lost the use of his legs and endured years of painful therapy and personal reinvention. Yet his illness, far from breaking him, seemed to strengthen his resolve and deepen his empathy. He had learned how to smile through struggle, how to lead from a wheelchair without ever being seen as weak, and how to speak with both authority and warmth, a rare combination in an era defined by suffering. Roosevelt's campaign message was simple but bold. A New Deal for the American people. Though few knew exactly what this promise would entail, it was the promise itself that captured the imagination of the nation. Roosevelt spoke not of retreat or helplessness, but of action. He promised experimentation, compassion, and federal leadership on a scale never before seen in peacetime America. He did not guarantee immediate recovery, but he vowed to try, and to keep trying, until relief was delivered. The election was not close. Roosevelt won in a landslide, carrying 42 of the 48 states, and defeating Hoover in both the Electoral College and the popular vote by overwhelming margins. When he took office in March 1933, the country was in freefall. Unemployment had climbed to nearly 25%. More than 5,000 banks had failed. Breadlines wound through every major city. Confidence in the financial system had all but evaporated. Roosevelt's inauguration speech, delivered beneath gray skies and radioed to millions of anxious listeners, struck a tone that was at once firm and reassuring. "The only thing we have to fear," he declared, "is fear itself." With those words, he challenged the nation to reclaim its spirit, and he signaled that a new kind of leadership, one rooted in boldness and empathy, had arrived. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt unleashed a torrent of legislative action. With Congress firmly behind him, he signed into law sweeping measures designed to stabilize the banking system, provide relief to the unemployed, and restore faith in capitalism. The Emergency Banking Act closed failing banks and reopened only those deemed solvent, restoring trust. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was created to insure savings accounts. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work planting trees, building trails, and restoring public lands. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, aimed to help farmers by reducing crop surpluses and raising prices. Roosevelt understood that the crisis was not just economic, it was emotional. Through his fireside chats, a series of informal radio addresses broadcast from the White House, he spoke directly to the American people, explaining policies, calming fears, and offering reassurance. He called them "my friends," and in return, they trusted him in a way no president had been trusted before. The New Deal was not without critics. Some on the right saw it as an attack on free enterprise. Some on the left believed it did not go far enough to address inequality. But for the millions who had been abandoned during the early years of the Depression, Roosevelt represented something far more valuable than ideology. He represented motion, compassion, and the belief that the government had a responsibility to act. The storm had not passed. Recovery would be slow. But with Roosevelt at the helm, the American people, for the first time in years, began to believe that they would survive it. As the early measures of Roosevelt's presidency began to take effect, a cautious but real shift occurred in the mood of the country. Confidence, which had vanished so thoroughly in the preceding years, began to stir again. It was not yet recovery, not in any true sense, but it was movement. In those desperate days, even small signs of hope carried enormous weight. Franklin Roosevelt, through policy and personality alike, had restored something intangible yet essential, the feeling that someone was trying. The New Deal, as it came to be known, was not a single policy but an evolving set of programs, reforms, and regulations designed to stabilize the economy, create jobs, and prevent future depressions. It unfolded in two broad phases. The first New Deal, 1933 to 1934, focused on immediate relief and recovery, and the second New Deal, 1935 to 1938, which introduced deeper structural reforms and broader social protections. One of the foundational elements of the New Deal was employment. Roosevelt believed that people did not simply need money, they needed work, purpose, and dignity. To that end, his administration launched an array of public works programs that employed millions. The Civil Works Administration, CWA, put people to work building roads, bridges, and schools. The Public Works Administration, PWA, funded larger infrastructure projects, dams, airports, public housing, helping modernize the country while putting bread on family tables. Among the most ambitious efforts was the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, a sweeping regional development program that transformed a vast, impoverished area of the South through dam construction, electrification, and environmental conservation. The TVA not only brought power to millions who had never known it, but also became a model for federal planning and economic renewal. But the New Deal did more than build structures. It reshaped the relationship between the American people and their government. In 1935, the Social Security Act was signed into law, establishing a system of old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to widows and dependent children. It was a profound shift, the first time the federal government accepted responsibility for the welfare of its citizens on such a scale. Though limited in its early form, and excluding certain groups such as agricultural and domestic workers, Social Security laid the foundation for the modern American safety net. The same year, the Wagner Act, or National Labor Relations Act, guaranteed workers the right to organize unions and engage in collective bargaining. For decades, labor had fought for recognition, often facing violent suppression. Now, under federal law, their voices would be protected. Union membership soared. Strikes became a powerful tool for workers seeking fair wages and conditions. The workplace, long a realm dominated by unchecked corporate power, began to shift toward a more balanced system. Not all was smooth. The Supreme Court struck down several key New Deal laws, prompting Roosevelt in 1937 to propose a controversial court packing plan that would allow him to appoint additional justices. Though the plan failed and drew fierce criticism, the court soon began to uphold New Deal legislation, and the broader program survived. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression. The economy remained fragile throughout the 1930s, and unemployment, though improved, never returned to pre-crash levels. Still, it transformed the role of the federal government, built modern infrastructure, empowered labor, regulated banking, and brought millions into the fold of social protection. Perhaps most importantly, it redefined what Americans could expect from their democracy. No longer would the federal government be a distant entity limited to tariffs and treaties. It had become, under Roosevelt, a force that intervened, imperfectly but deliberately, in the lives of ordinary people to protect, support, and rebuild. The nation was not yet healed, but it had changed. By the late 1930s, The New Deal had etched itself into the fabric of American life. Roads had been paved, bridges built, rivers dammed, and electricity brought to homes that had never known light after sundown. Millions of unemployed workers had found temporary relief through federal programs, and labor had achieved a legal recognition it had never enjoyed before. Yet for all its accomplishments, the New Deal was reaching the limits of what it could achieve in the face of persistent economic stagnation and rising global uncertainty. Though unemployment had dropped significantly from its terrifying peak in 1933, it still hovered above 15% in 1937. Industrial production had improved, but remained below pre-depression levels. Consumer confidence was fragile, and many businesses still hesitated to hire or expand, uncertain whether the recovery would hold. Farmers continued to struggle with debt, market volatility, and environmental degradation, despite federal support. In 1937, Roosevelt, concerned about the growing federal deficit and convinced that the worst of the Depression had passed, made the fateful decision to scale back New Deal spending. Almost immediately, the consequences were felt. The economy contracted sharply. Unemployment began to rise again. What followed was dubbed the Roosevelt Recession, a painful reminder that, for all its progress, the recovery was still fragile and deeply dependent on government support. Critics on both sides seized the moment. Conservatives had long accused Roosevelt of undermining free enterprise, expanding government beyond its proper bounds, and spending recklessly. They viewed the recession as evidence that the New Deal had distorted the economy and delayed true recovery. Meanwhile, voices on the left, including some labor leaders, socialists, and populists, argued that the New Deal had not gone far enough, that inequality still flourished, and that systemic injustices remained untouched. Roosevelt responded by renewing stimulus spending and expanding programs such as the Works Progress Administration, WPA, which once again mobilized millions of unemployed Americans to build, repair, and improve public infrastructure. By 1939, economic indicators had improved somewhat, but the overall situation remained precarious. The Depression, in truth, still lingered. It had not been solved, it had been managed, mitigated, and softened, but not yet vanquished. Meanwhile, beyond America's borders, another storm had begun to gather. In Europe, economic hardship and nationalist sentiment had fed the rise of fascist regimes. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had already invaded Ethiopia. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had rearmed, remilitarized the Rhineland, and begun openly violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. In Asia, Japan had expanded into Manchuria and later into the Chinese mainland. The world was hurtling, almost blindly, toward another war, one that would eclipse the first in both scale and devastation. Roosevelt, aware of the growing danger abroad, began quietly preparing the United States for the possibility of involvement, even as public opinion remained strongly isolationist. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts, designed to keep America out of foreign conflicts. But Roosevelt, while publicly respecting the law, looked for ways to support democracies under threat, particularly Britain and France. In his speeches, he began to shift tone, speaking not only of economic justice at home but of the defense of democracy worldwide. The Depression, it turned out, was not an isolated chapter in American history, but part of a larger global narrative, a crisis of capitalism, democracy, and social cohesion that touched every nation, tested every institution, and exposed every weakness. By 1939, after a full decade of struggle, the United States remained bruised but unbroken. Its economy was still hobbled. Its people still wary. But it had avoided collapse. It had tried new things. It had dared to imagine a different relationship between government and governed. And as war clouds gathered across the oceans, it stood on the edge of yet another defining transformation, one that would finally lift it out of the Depression's grip, but at a price few could have foreseen. When German forces crossed into Poland on September 1, 1939, plunging Europe into a Second World War, the United States remained officially neutral. But though American soldiers would not set foot on European soil for more than 2 years, the effects of that invasion, and the global conflict it unleashed, would prove to be the final and unexpected force that brought the Great Depression to an end. At first, America's role was that of a supplier. Under Roosevelt's leadership, the U.S. began to retool its factories, not for domestic consumption or infrastructure, but for the production of arms, vehicles, and industrial goods needed by the Allies. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in 1941, allowed the U.S. to send enormous quantities of material to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other nations resisting Axis aggression. The scale of this industrial mobilization was vast, and it had immediate effects on the domestic economy. Idle factories came back to life. Machines long silent roared again with purpose. Production soared, and with it, employment. Workers were needed, tens of thousands of them, to build tanks, airplanes, ships, and munitions. Job advertisements once again appeared in newspapers. Unemployment, which had hovered stubbornly around 15% throughout the 1930s, plummeted. By 1942, it had fallen below 5%, and by the following year, it was practically non-existent. Men who had once drifted across the country in search of work were now drafted or hired for war industries. Women, long kept at the margins of industrial labor, entered factories in vast numbers, symbolized by the enduring figure of Rosie the Riveter. African Americans, though still facing deep segregation and discrimination, began migrating to northern cities to take part in the war effort, initiating the early waves of what would become the Second Great Migration. The war did more than create jobs, it reordered American society. Rationing, war bonds, price controls, and government contracts became everyday realities. The federal government, already expanded by the New Deal, grew even larger, coordinating nearly every aspect of production and consumption. Taxes were raised, the national debt ballooned, and the economy, for the first time in over a decade, operated at full capacity. In the span of just a few years, the Great Depression, that slow, grinding catastrophe that had drained a generation of its optimism and stability, seemed to vanish under the flood of wartime demand. Yet it is important to remember that it was not peace that ended the Depression, but total war. And while full employment and rising wages returned, they came only after unimaginable human cost abroad and unprecedented federal control at home. The Depression left behind more than economic damage. It changed how Americans thought about work, government, and each other. It revealed the limits of unregulated capitalism and the necessity of a social safety net. It introduced the idea that government could, and perhaps should, play a permanent role in ensuring economic stability and protecting the vulnerable. It gave rise to institutions that still exist today: Social Security, unemployment insurance, labor protections, and financial regulation. It also forged a generation hardened by hardship, shaped by scarcity, and tested by failure. They learned to save, to make do, to distrust easy promises, and to find pride in perseverance. It was a generation that came of age in soup lines, sent their sons to war, and rebuilt the country with caution and care. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the United States emerged not only as the world's dominant military power, but also as its economic leader. But it carried forward the memory of those long, dark years, of bank failures and dust storms, of breadlines and silent factories, and the hard lessons learned during the Great Depression continued to shape public policy and national identity for decades to come. The Depression was not simply a period of economic downturn, it was a crucible. And from its fire, a new America was forged.